The month was May 1945. The thunder of artillery had at last gone quiet, leaving behind a Europe that felt hollowed out and stunned. Cities that once rang with church bells and cafe chatter now lay in gray ruin, their streets littered with rubble and silence. Hitler was dead. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years had collapsed in 12. Yet amid the ashes, the Allies faced an unexpected problem, one rarely told in the grand narratives of victory. What to do with the captured soldiers who were not soldiers in the way the world imagined? Women in gray-green uniforms, secretaries and radio operators, nurses and clerks who had served the Nazi war machine and were now technically prisoners of war. For the Americans who encountered them, the first sight was startling. Train cars rattled into temporary holding yards near the French ports of Le Havre and Cherbourg, carrying weary columns of German captives. The men had come first, gaunt and stubbled, thousands upon thousands. But now there were women, young, pale, some barely 20, wearing worn Luftwaffe blouses or field gray skirts, caps pulled low to hide faces flushed with humiliation. They looked nothing like the enemy soldiers of propaganda posters. Some still tried to maintain the last scrap of dignity, their boots polished, their hair neatly braided. Others looked broken, clutching small suitcases or photographs of family, their eyes hollowed out by defeat. Private First Class Danny Carter, a 21-year-old military policeman from Ohio, remembered the moment vividly in his diary. "We were told to expect POWs," he wrote, "but I didn't think they'd be girls. They came down the gangplank slow, quiet, not one trying to run or shout. Just looking at us like we were from another planet." Danny had landed at Normandy less than a year before. He'd seen German guns shred his unit on a hedgerow line and buried friends along the road to Paris. Yet as he stood on the dock with his rifle, staring at these women, some barely older than his kid sister, he felt his anger unravel into something more complicated. America's decision to ship prisoners across the Atlantic was partly practical and partly psychological. Europe was drowning in displaced persons. The U.S. had the space and the resources to house captives humanely under the Geneva Convention. By war's end, over 400,000 German POWs would spend time in America, a handful of them women. They were to be held at camps scattered across the country: Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and dozens of smaller compounds built of wood and wire in rural fields. Few Americans had ever seen the enemy up close. Fewer still had imagined that enemy could look like the quiet young women now stepping off those ships. Among them was Liesel Weber, 23, who had served as a communications aide for the Luftwaffe. She had grown up in Bremen, the daughter of a dock worker and a seamstress. When the war came, she joined the auxiliary service at 18, believing it a patriotic duty, not knowing where it would lead. By the war's final months, she had been stationed near Hamburg, listening to frantic messages as Allied bombs fell nightly. Now, in surrender, she stood on foreign soil with no clear future. She pulled her coat tighter as an Atlantic wind whipped across the pier and glanced at the American soldiers. They seemed impossibly tall, well-fed, their uniforms clean. She wondered if they hated her. The journey inland was surreal. Guards rode with them on buses and trains, but there was little hostility. Some American MPs tried halting German. Others kept silent, wary of any friendliness. Liesel sat by the window watching landscapes roll by, first the French countryside, then ports, then the endless sea, then weeks later the green sprawl of an unfamiliar continent. She thought often of home, her mother's small kitchen, the smell of rye bread, the ache of knowing Bremen was likely rubble now. For the Americans who ran the camps, the presence of women was a novelty. Captain Robert Hale, commander at Fort Oglethorpe, later remarked in an interview, "We had protocols for enemy combatants, but not for this. They weren't spies, not saboteurs, just clerks and nurses swept up by war." Still, they wore the uniform of the Reich. There was tension in that contradiction. To treat them gently felt dangerous. To treat them harshly felt wrong. Arrival at Fort Oglethorpe was, for Liesel and the others, a bewildering mix of fear and strange relief. The camp stretched wide under a Georgia sun far hotter than anything they had known. Wooden barracks lined in neat rows, barbed wire gleaming, watchtowers silent but watchful. American guards stood by as the women were processed. Names recorded, photographs taken, meager belongings inspected. They were searched but not humiliated. Given clean linens, assigned bunks, briefed on camp rules. Geneva Convention rights were explained through interpreters. Adequate food, medical care, letters home permitted. It was more dignity than many expected after propaganda had warned them of Allied cruelty. Still, mistrust hung heavy. The women kept to themselves at first, whispering in German, wary of eyes watching. They mourned quietly, brothers lost on the Eastern Front, fathers never returned from Stalingrad, lovers swallowed by U-boat graves. They were enemies, yes, but also widows of a war they had not controlled. At night, some cried into their thin pillows. Others stared at the ceiling, numb. Danny Carter was assigned to perimeter patrol. At first, he tried not to think of them as women at all, just prisoners. But curiosity gnawed. He noticed how they lined up each morning, neat as schoolgirls, some refusing to meet his gaze, others offering a quick, proud glance. One afternoon, he caught sight of a few laughing softly among themselves while hanging laundry, and it startled him, the sound of laughter behind barbed wire. It was not what he expected from the defeated enemy. Food became the first strange battleground. The American mess hall served hearty rations. White bread, beans, canned vegetables, coffee by the gallon. For women used to ration cards and thin cabbage stews, the abundance was overwhelming and alien. Liesel took one bite of fluffy sandwich bread and nearly gagged. "We Kuchen," she whispered to her bunkmate. It was like cake, sweet and strange. Peanut butter was an object of suspicion. Canned fruit seemed unreal. There was an undercurrent of quiet pride among the German women too. They had endured bombings, scarcity, defeat. They would not appear needy. "Wir sind kein Bettler," one said firmly, "we are not beggars." They tried to keep dignity even in captivity. Yet hunger is persuasive. Some traded scraps of knowledge with the American cooks, pointing at ingredients, laughing shyly when misunderstood. Small, hesitant bridges formed. Still, beneath the surface there lingered the raw truth. These were the faces of the enemy, and America was not sure how to feel about them. Soldiers who had fought through Normandy and the Bulge walked past the wire and stared, remembering friends killed by German fire. Townspeople drove by slowly, gawking, unsure if compassion or contempt was right. Newspapers rarely mentioned the women. Their presence was an odd footnote in the vast machinery of war's end. Liesel, for her part, moved through her days with quiet observation. She was grateful for the safety, the food, the clean clothes. Yet each night she felt the weight of guilt and confusion. She had joined to serve her country, not to kill. But had she served evil? Could she ever go home without shame? The Americans seemed kind but distant. She longed to speak, to ask questions, but her English was poor and pride held her back. Then one evening, as the Georgia sky burned orange and guards swapped shifts, the smell of something utterly foreign wafted from the mess hall. It was rich, buttery, tinged with the sea, a scent she could not name. Around her, other women sniffed curiously. A rumor passed in quick German whispers. The Americans were serving some kind of seafood stew tonight. "Lobster," someone said. "Clams." The barracks erupted in incredulous laughter. "Lobster? Those ugly sea bugs? In soup?" Surely this was another joke from their captors, a test to see if they would eat anything. Danny, standing watch nearby, heard the chuckles and caught a few translated words. "They think we're crazy," he murmured to another guard with a grin. In the mess, American cooks stirred giant vats of creamy chowder, ladling it into waiting pots. It was coastal food far from home, sent inland by the Navy to feed the camps. To the Americans it was comfort fare. To the Germans it sounded absurd. But as the line formed and the first bowls were served, the laughter began to fade. Steam curled up in the humid night, carrying the smell of butter and brine and unfamiliar spices. Liesel held her tin bowl, skeptical yet hungry, the memory of endless thin stews tugging at her resolve. She lifted a spoon slowly, cautiously, as though the act itself might betray something deep inside. One taste, and her eyes widened. Around her, others paused, then smiled in quiet surprise. What began as mockery was changing, spoon by spoon. The war was over, but something unexpected was happening here, in this small camp half a world away from home. Enemies were discovering the first fragile thread of shared humanity, through a meal neither side could have imagined. The first spoonful had broken the silence, but it was only the beginning of a slow, strange transformation. In the weeks that followed, food became the camp's quiet theater of war, a place where suspicion and pride wrestled against hunger and curiosity. The Americans, efficient and practical, cooked in cavernous mess halls where steam rose like low clouds, carrying smells that baffled the prisoners. The German women, raised on a continent starved and scarred, approached each meal with wary eyes and stiff backs. Every tray, every unfamiliar dish was a reminder that they were no longer masters of their own fate. Liesel Weber sat at one of the long wooden tables, her hands folded in her lap as a guard passed with a metal pot, ladling out breakfast, scrambled eggs soft and yellow, a pile of toast so white it seemed almost artificial, and again, coffee strong enough to make her nose wrinkle. Across from her, her bunkmate Hilda Bauer smirked. "Americaner," Hilda whispered, shaking her head. Always too much. Too soft. Too sweet. Hilda had been a typist for an army logistics office in Munich. She wore her bitterness like a badge. But even she couldn't hide the way her fork lingered over the eggs before she finally ate. Liesel smiled faintly. Hunger, she thought, had a way of silencing even the proud. Outside, the camp's fences hummed faintly with the wind. Guards walked slow circuits, boots crunching on gravel. Among them was Danny Carter, his face still boyish under the brim of his cap, though the war had already etched thin lines around his eyes. He had started to recognize faces. The tall woman with the braid who nodded politely, the one who sang under her breath while sweeping. And then there was Liesel, the quiet one who seemed to watch everything but say little. He caught himself looking for her more than he meant to. Something about her stillness pulled at him, though he could not have said why. In the kitchens, meanwhile, an unspoken contest was brewing. The American cooks, most of them army men unaccustomed to feeding women prisoners, worked with whatever the supply trucks brought. One day it was endless cans of pork and beans, the next crates of powdered milk and sacks of flour, then unexpectedly barrels of clams and lobster tails shipped from a naval depot in New England. Chief Cook Sergeant Joe Mancini, a stocky Italian-American with a wry grin, took pride in making do. "We'll feed 'em right," he told his team, enemy or not. That's the American way. But when the first seafood chowder was met with snickers and hesitant spoons, Joe's pride bristled. "They laugh now," he muttered, "but wait till they taste real butter." For the German women, food was memory and identity. They had grown up on dark rye bread dense as stone, on smoked sausages, cabbage stews, potatoes stretched to fill empty stomachs. Meat had been scarce for years, butter a luxury. By 1945, many had survived on thin rations and ersatz substitutes that smelled faintly of despair. To be handed plates brimming with eggs, milk, and strange sweet jams felt decadent and suspicious. "It is propaganda," muttered an older prisoner one night, sitting with Liesel. "They feed us well, so we tell Germany that America is paradise." Liesel didn't answer. Perhaps it was true. But her stomach still warmed with every meal. Yet something began to shift around the long tables. Curiosity chipped at caution. After that first chowder night, more women approached the serving line with less mockery and more interest. They asked haltingly about ingredients. Some tried to copy English words: butter, cream, clam. Laughter softened, no longer biting but surprised. One evening, Hilda whispered to Liesel after tasting cornbread for the first time, "It is strange, but good." Her expression was half defiant, half sheepish, as if admitting pleasure to the enemy might be treason. Danny noticed too. On patrol one afternoon, he passed the laundry lines where several women were talking and laughing. Their German was quick and musical, but a few English words floated through: chowder, lobster, pronounced carefully like secrets. He grinned despite himself. Later, during his break, he lingered by the kitchen door, watching Sergeant Mancini supervise a massive pot. "You're making friends out there, Joe," Danny teased. Mancini snorted. "Food's better than bullets, kid. Even Nazis gotta eat." Still, not everyone welcomed this slow thaw. Some American guards kept their distance, haunted by memories of fallen friends. A sergeant who had lost a brother at Bastogne muttered that the prisoners were playing nice to earn favors. Local townsfolk occasionally drove past the camp fence, tossing wary looks or muttered curses. One newspaper editorial called the POW treatment too soft on those who served evil. In the barracks, too, not all women embraced the strange new cuisine. A few refused certain dishes out of stubborn pride, scraping plates clean only when truly starving. But others leaned in. Small alliances sprouted in the kitchens themselves. One rainy afternoon, Liesel found herself volunteering for cleanup duty. Inside, heat from the stoves fogged the windows, and the air smelled of yeast and frying onions. Mancini was shouting directions to his crew when he noticed her lingering. "You, Fräulein," he said in halting German, tapping his chest. "Joe." He pointed to a pile of bowls needing scrubbing. She nodded, unsure if she should speak. As she worked, Joe watched, then chuckled and held up a loaf of soft white bread. "Brat," he said. "Good?" Liesel hesitated, then made a face that said, "S." The kitchen erupted in laughter. For a brief moment, enemy lines blurred over soap and bread. That night, she wrote in her journal, a habit she had kept even in captivity. The cook tried to say bread in German. Everyone laughed. It felt human. She did not know how to feel about that. The camp's command, observing these small shifts, allowed cautious cultural exchanges. The Red Cross encouraged humane treatment. officials noted that content prisoners caused fewer problems. Soon, American recipes and German ones began to cross the wire in whispered trade. One of the younger cooks tried to bake a dense rye loaf using a German prisoner's advice. In return, Liesel and Hilda were taught to say, "Thank you," and "Good morning." It was not friendship exactly, but it was something gentler than hatred. And always there was the food, plentiful, bewildering, persuasive. The chowder became a small legend. Word spread among the barracks that the Americans knew how to coax flavor from the sea. Lobster, once mocked as the cockroach of the ocean, was now savored, even craved. Clams no longer seemed alien. Butter, rich and golden, was passed from hand to hand like contraband joy. Hunger broke barriers where ideology had failed. Yet each meal also reminded the women of what they had lost. They thought of home kitchens bombed to rubble, of mothers boiling thin soups to feed children through winter, of the propaganda that had promised them victory but delivered starvation. Sitting at a wooden table under the watch of armed guards, spooning rich chowder into her mouth, Liesel sometimes felt tears prick her eyes, not for the food, but for the world that might have been if such simple abundance had not been twisted into war. Danny, too, wrestled with conflicting emotions. One night on patrol he saw Liesel sitting alone by the barracks window, staring out at the dark. She looked fragile in the lamplight, yet proud. He thought of his brother back home, of the friends buried in foreign soil. He wondered if kindness dishonored them. But then he remembered the first time he'd tasted a real home-cooked meal after weeks of army rations and how it had felt like touching life again. Maybe, he thought, there was no dishonor in letting someone else feel human too. As summer deepened, the kitchen became more than a place of sustenance. It was a fragile bridge, creaky, imperfect, but real. Guards and prisoners began exchanging hesitant smiles, then brief words. Food softened the camp's sharp edges, though no one dared name it peace. Outside the fence, America was preparing to move on. Victory parades, the looming Pacific War, the slow shift to rebuilding Europe. Inside, the small daily ritual of meals became its own quiet rebellion against hatred. But not everyone was ready to surrender to that quiet. Rumors swirled among the prisoners that new shipments of food were coming, stranger than before, perhaps meant to win them over fully. Some scoffed, some were intrigued. One humid evening, Sergeant Mancini stood in the supply room staring at crates just delivered from the coast. He chuckled, shaking his head, then shouted for his team. "Boys," he said, "get ready to teach these gals about America. We're going big." That night, while the women slept under the hum of ceiling fans and the guards patrolled under a sky full of restless stars, the kitchen lights burned late. Pots clanged, knives chopped, butter melted into something rich and fragrant. Whatever the Americans were planning, it promised to be more than just dinner. And for Liesel, who had begun to feel cracks in the wall she'd built inside, it would mean another small test of pride, hunger, and the unexpected power of a meal. The night the new meal was served, the camp seemed to hold its breath. From the mess hall drifted a scent so rich it almost silenced conversation. A warm tide of butter and cream cut with a briny whisper of the sea. The Americans had outdone themselves. Sergeant Mancini, sleeves rolled high, commanded his kitchen crew with the precision of a general. Cauldrons of chowder simmered until their surface quivered like pale silk. Crates of lobster tails had been cracked and chopped, their sweet flesh folded into the creamy broth. Clams, heavy and slick, had been scrubbed clean and stirred in until the pot sang of ocean depths none of the women had ever seen. Liesel approached the serving line slowly, caught between defiance and curiosity. She had promised herself she would not be charmed again, not so easily. Behind her, Hilda whispered sharp jokes in German about the Americans trying to butter up the enemy. Yet when the ladle poured its steaming contents into Liesel's bowl, the scent alone undid her resolve. The broth gleamed pale gold, dotted with pink lobster and soft chunks of potato. Steam rose to meet her face, carrying a sweetness she could not name. She sat down with her tray, the tin warm beneath her fingers. Around her, the other women's voices dropped to murmurs. No one wanted to be the first to try. It was Hilda, surprisingly, who broke the silence. "Essich," she muttered and scooped up a spoonful, eyes narrowing as she chewed. A beat passed. Then, reluctantly, "Es schmeckt. Tastes good." Laughter rippled down the table, quiet but real. Liesel raised her own spoon, tasting carefully. The flavor hit with unexpected gentleness. The richness of cream, the delicate sweetness of lobster, the faint salt of clams. It was indulgent but not cloying, warm in a way that seemed to seep past hunger into something deeper. She blinked hard, fighting a sudden wave of memory. Her mother stirring potato soup, the smell of the North Sea on summer evenings. For a moment she forgot she was a prisoner. Danny Carter, watching from the doorway on break, saw the change. He'd grown used to the prisoners' wary posture, their careful way of eating. But tonight something softened. Women leaned toward one another, murmuring, tasting. A few even smiled. The room's usual brittle quiet gave way to low hums of conversation. It struck him that this was what peace might look like. Not parades, not treaties, but people tasting something unfamiliar and finding it good. Later, after the trays were cleared, Sergeant Mancini stepped into the dining room. He didn't speak German, but he raised a hand and offered a grin. A smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then more certain. Some of the women clapped softly, others only watched with guarded eyes, but the air had shifted. Food had done what speeches could not, made enemies feel human. The change didn't happen overnight. Pride lingered. Some women still muttered that the Americans were trying to seduce them with fat and sugar. Others ate silently, refusing to give praise. But the walls began to crack. Curiosity grew bolder. During cleanup duty the next week, Liesel asked one of the cooks in careful English what gave the chowder its taste. Cream, the man said, holding up a tin. Butter. She repeated the words, tasting their shape, earning a friendly chuckle. Soon, recipes began to trade hands like contraband. A guard asked about sauerkraut, a prisoner offered advice on strudel dough. Someone drew diagrams for baking rye bread in the camp ovens. These were tiny rebellions against hatred, unofficial, unrecorded, but alive. The Americans still held power, the war was still fresh, yet inside the kitchen something unexpected blossomed, a quiet exchange of culture that no command order could have planned. For Liesel, the shift was deeply personal. She had come to America ashamed and defensive, clinging to the belief that nothing here could touch her. But food had a way of undoing walls she didn't know she'd built. She began to greet Danny with a small nod when their paths crossed. She stayed after meals to help scrub pans, listening to Mancini hum Sinatra tunes as he worked. Once, she surprised herself by laughing when a cook tried to pronounce Kartoffelnudel and failed spectacularly. It felt dangerous to laugh but also healing. Danny, for his part, stopped seeing only the enemy when he looked at the prisoners. One evening he offered a shy wave to Liesel as she left the mess hall. She hesitated, then returned it with the barest lift of her fingers. It was nothing, and yet, after a war where kindness had seemed impossible, it was everything. Still, the larger conflict hummed underneath. Outside the camp, headlines reminded America of Nazi atrocities, of a Europe still bleeding. Inside, letters from home warned guards to stay vigilant. And for the prisoners, the shame of defeat never fully lifted. Many still dreamed of rubble-strewn streets and starving families left behind. But now another feeling had crept in alongside the guilt, a fragile awareness that life could hold warmth again. One humid afternoon, as Liesel helped peel potatoes in the sweltering kitchen, Sergeant Mancini leaned over with a conspiratorial smile. "Tomorrow," he said slowly, choosing each word, "apple pie." Liesel tilted her head, unsure if she understood. Mancini grinned wider. "American classic." He mimed rolling dough, sprinkling sugar. The other women nearby perked up, whispering translations. A ripple of excitement passed through the room, soft but undeniable. That night, Liesel wrote in her journal, her handwriting small and precise. "I am learning their words. Cream. Butter. But I do not know if this is betrayal or survival. But for the first time, the food here tastes of more than defeat." Beyond the barbed wire, summer cicadas droned and floodlights hummed. The camp was still a prison. The war was still close enough to taste. Yet something subtle and unstoppable was happening over stoves and steaming bowls. A surrender not of armies but of hearts, a recognition that the enemy's food could be delicious, that the enemy's laughter could sound like one's own. And now, with each passing meal, the Americans were preparing one more quiet blow to the walls between them. A dessert so deeply tied to their homeland that even the most guarded prisoner might find her resolve tested when the scent of cinnamon and warm apples drifted across the barracks. Autumn came quietly to Georgia, softening the relentless summer heat and painting the camp's edges in shades of amber and rust. The women noticed it first in the cool dawns when they lined up for roll call, breath fogging in the chill air. By then, the war felt both very near and impossibly far. Letters trickled in from shattered Germany, some bringing relief that loved ones were alive, others carrying the blunt grief of loss. Many of the women read them in silence, faces pale and eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the fence. The United States, so foreign when they had arrived, had become strangely familiar. The smell of wood smoke from the guardhouse, the clang of mess hall trays, the faint croon of a radio leaking Sinatra into the evening air. Liesel had changed in ways she didn't yet understand. When she first stepped off the ship, she had clung to silence like armor. Now, though still cautious, she could greet Danny with a nod that sometimes bloomed into a quiet, "Good morning." She no longer flinched at the sound of American laughter. The kitchens had been her quiet classroom. She learned the words for pie and stew, for cinnamon and sugar, though she spoke them shyly, careful not to seem too eager. In return, the cooks had asked her about Germany, about bread baked black and dense, about pickled cabbage and spiced Christmas cakes. These exchanges were small, but they had loosened something tight in her chest. Danny felt the change too. He had come to Fort Oglethorpe as a soldier trained to see enemies, his heart scarred by what he'd survived in France. Yet months of quiet duty had complicated that clarity. He had watched these women mourn news from home, sew torn blouses with trembling hands, light up at the smell of warm food. They were not the faceless monsters he'd once imagined. They were people swept into a storm they hadn't controlled. That didn't erase the war or his dead friends, but it altered something in the way he held his rifle and the way he looked across the fence. The apple pie came and went like a festival in miniature. The day it was served, the mess hall filled with an aroma so sweet it seemed almost mischievous. Cinnamon curled through the air, coaxing wary smiles even from the most reserved. Liesel took her first bite with quiet awe. It was warm, spiced, unlike anything she had tasted. For a moment, she closed her eyes and felt the simple grace of sweetness in a world that had been bitter too long. The pie didn't change history, but it softened the room in a way speeches never could. Guards chuckled as prisoners tried the word delicious, fumbling its syllables but laughing at themselves. For a night, the barbed wire felt less sharp. Yet kindness and comfort existed alongside unease. The women knew they were still prisoners, still marked by the swastika's shadow. Some wrestled with shame each day. Hilda, once defiant, grew quieter after a letter informed her that her brother had died in Soviet captivity. "For what?" she whispered one evening to Liesel. "For nothing. All of it for nothing." Liesel could not answer. She felt guilt she could not name, guilt for wearing a uniform that had served evil even if she had never fired a shot. The food, the laughter, the small kindnesses, they were lifelines, but they could not erase the war's stain. Outside the camp, America debated what to do with its prisoners. The war in Europe was over, but the Pacific conflict had ended in mushroom clouds, and the nation was turning toward rebuilding. Officials spoke of repatriation. Ships would soon carry the Germans home to a country divided and starved. For the women, the news brought a strange mix of relief and dread. Home meant family but also ruins. It meant facing the judgment of neighbors and the ghosts of those lost. It meant leaving the fragile safety they'd found in an enemy's kitchen. For Liesel, the thought was dizzying. She had come to expect the rhythm of the camp, the morning calls, the shared chores, the slow evenings when guards leaned on fences and the sky turned lavender. Leaving meant stepping back into a Germany she no longer recognized. One night, unable to sleep, she stood by the window and watched Danny pass on patrol. Their eyes met for a brief, quiet moment. Neither spoke, but the look was enough. A recognition that whatever they had built here was temporary, and perhaps that was what made it precious. The day of departure came cold and gray. Buses rolled up to the camp gates, engines humming. The women were given their few belongings, some new clothes donated by the Red Cross, small parcels of food for the journey. Guards gathered to oversee the loading. There were no bands, no flags, just the scrape of boots on gravel and the rustle of belongings hastily packed. Yet beneath the efficiency lay a current of emotion no one wanted to admit. Hilda clutched Liesel's hand tightly before boarding. "We are ghosts going home," she whispered. Liesel tried to smile but couldn't. Her heart ached with conflicting tides. Relief to return, sorrow to leave this strange place where enemies had shown her unexpected humanity. Danny stood near the buses, his rifle slung but forgotten. When Liesel reached him in the line, she hesitated. He gave a small, uncertain nod. She swallowed, then spoke softly in broken English, "Thank you." It was all she could manage, but it was enough. His eyes softened. He wanted to say something back. Safe travels, stay alive, be more than what the war made you, but the words caught in his throat. Instead he tipped his cap. For a soldier and a former enemy it was more than enough. Sergeant Mancini appeared, wiping his hands on his apron, a grin masking the shine in his eyes. He handed Liesel a small wrapped parcel. She opened it to find a slice of pie, carefully packaged for the road. "For home," he said simply. She blinked back tears, whispered "Danky," and tucked it away. In that moment, the distance between captor and captive felt paper-thin. The buses rumbled out through the gates, carrying the women toward ships and an uncertain future. Some waved timidly through the glass. Some stared ahead, too numb for farewell. Guards stood silent, hats in hand. Danny watched until the last bus vanished down the long, dusty road. He didn't know if he'd ever see any of them again. But he knew something had shifted in him, that hatred could give way to understanding, that enemies could be human, and that even in war's aftermath, kindness had power. Liesel watched America blur past the bus window. Fields, small towns, distant city skylines. She thought of her mother's ruined kitchen, of brothers lost, of the camp where she had tasted lobster for the first time and laughed despite herself. She thought of Danny's silent nod, of Mancini's pie. Somewhere between despair and hope, she felt a fragile thread of gratitude. The world had taught her to fear and to hate. But behind barbed wire, she had discovered a quieter truth. That people could surprise you, that humanity could survive even in enemy hands. Years later, she would tell her children about that time in America, though rarely in detail. She would mention the hunger, the fear, the long voyage home. But she would linger on one memory, the first spoonful of chowder, the first unexpected kindness, the strange power of food to heal what war had shattered. And though she would never excuse what her country had done, she would speak softly of the guards who chose humanity over vengeance. Danny, too, carried the memory. He returned to Ohio, built a life, tried to leave the war behind. Yet sometimes, when he smelled the sea or butter melting in a pan, he would remember the quiet German girl who said thank you with trembling lips. He would remember that being a soldier had taught him many things, but none more important than this. It is possible to hold grief for the dead and still choose mercy for the living. The story of those camps never made headlines. It did not change treaties or redraw borders. But in a world recovering from unimaginable cruelty, it whispered something powerful, that reconciliation begins not with speeches or politics, but with the simple human act of sharing a meal. It warned that hatred starves the soul, while generosity feeds it. And it suggested that the victors of one war could sow peace for the next not with weapons, but with bread, butter, and the courage to see an enemy's face. Somewhere beyond that fence, history moved on, nations rebuilt, alliances shifted, new conflicts arose. Yet the quiet lessons lingered, that dignity matters, that kindness disarms, that survival is more than staying alive. It is finding the courage to be human when the world tells you to hate. Liesel would one day bake apple pies for her own children, never quite able to explain why the smell of cinnamon made her both ache and hope. Danny would tell his grandchildren that once, long ago, he guarded enemies who were just young women trying to survive, and that sometimes the smallest mercies matter most. And perhaps, if you listen closely to the echoes of that time, you will hear the soft clatter of trays, the hum of a kitchen at war with hatred, and the first fragile laughter of former enemies tasting peace, one spoonful at a time.